Welcome to Corrective Consciousness Podcast Episode 157, the podcast where we explore the inanity of pop culture. I'm your host, vysethebold, and this is...
Lotus Prince.
And OldManStompy.
Well, this episode we wanted to give OldManStompy a platform to talk about some of the interesting going-ons in wrestling. There seems to be a lot of competition for once for WWE that's at least interesting. It might not be on the same level, but I'm interested to hear about that and also his other perspectives on the other events. So without further ado, OldManStompy, why don't you take the platform and talk about it today?
Sure thing.
So, we talked a little bit on a couple of the previous episodes that I was on that there's a new show coming out, AEW. They're expected to basically take the time slot of old WCW on TNT, which is a pretty big deal. They poached a couple of big stars away from the WWF, most notably Dean Ambrose and Chris Jericho. And it feels like, Raw's been, the flagship WWF show has been sort of flagging a little bit. The ratings have been going down. They don't have like a super hot
star right now, like that everybody's talking about, like they did, even 10 years ago.
So that's an important thing to touch on. One of the principal problems people have with the brand is that it feels like the McMahon family is a little bit too central, and that they have not done a very good job of, and arguably this is intentional, that they've like partially sabotaged their stars to prevent them from doing what The Rock did and what John Cena did, and of eventually becoming bigger than the brand, or even Dave Bautista. Eventually becoming bigger than the brand and going off and becoming a movie star and like no longer needing, the WWF. I think it drives Vince McMahon crazy. He has notorious abandonment issues that stem all the way back to his childhood. So I don't even know if he's doing it on purpose, but it feels like a lot of the time that's like how they're conducting business. And they had kind of a ascendant star in Becky Lynch, who they allowed to be the first woman to win in the main event of WrestleMania, beating Charlotte Flair and Ronda Rousey. But then Rousey left, and they've been trying to kind of keep her away from Charlotte Flair for a while to build up the next really big match. And as a result, there just is nobody. It's made her title run kind of crappy because there just is nobody else like of that caliber to get you excited about the women's title now that Rousey's gone. So, they did make one kind of interesting move, and this seems like deeply ironic, which is that they hired Paul Heyman and Eric Bischoff. If those names sound like vaguely familiar, Paul Heyman is he's best known right now in wrestling as the advocate for CM Punk and Brock Lesnar. He's a longtime friend of CM Punk. He was friends with him all the way up to, and still is friends with him after he left WWF. And of course now he's the mouthpiece for Brock Lesnar, who is a notoriously bad promo. He has like a weirdly nasally voice that sounds creepy when he talks like only a little bit, but is not built for, wrestling style acting. So Paul's always been his mouthpiece, but Paul's also the creator of ECW. He founded it with money from his family, and he for a long time during the Attitude Era was the trendsetter. He was the one who pushed wrestling to become like really edgy. To put in a lot of the sex and the blood that eventually became like a staple in the WWF in the mid-90s, and that launched the careers. ECW launched the career of Steve Austin, most notably. It was one of the first companies that gave him a good chance to deliver a promo, to like be the kind of wrestler they could be. They folded. He had no business acumen. He was just throwing money at things all the time. By the end of ECW, it's almost like once his ideas got co-opted by WWF, as is tradition in monopolies, he just could not sign stars anymore. He didn't have the money to compete with them, and since they were putting out a similar product, he eventually went out of business. The other guy they hired is Eric Bischoff, who was the executive producer of WCW during the era of the New World Order. When they signed Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash to be these like outsiders who were like deliberately pulled out of WWF to be like the next, to be like this invading force, this like cancer that grew inside WCW, and they became like dominant heels for a real long time. But eventually, the show began to revolve too much around these like aging stars, and Bischoff did basically nothing about it. All the young guys jumped ship to WWF. Chris Jericho, Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Perry Saturn, like all these guys left. And WCW was left with a bunch of guys in their 40s and 50s who could barely wrestle and wanted and didn't want to lose matches to anybody, and rapidly went out of business after that. So it's a little weird that Vince's big, ace up his sleeve to stop themselves from losing, to right the sinking ship is to hire the two guys he put out of business to run his shows for him. And it's been okay so far. The biggest benefit that I've heard sort of through the grapevine is that Vince was notorious for going to producer meetings and just completely rewriting the show. He had an army of Hollywood writers who would write the show for him, and then he would just come to the producers meeting every week and he would just tear the whole thing up and he'd write it all over again from scratch, like 3 hours before the show started. A lot of the time.
Why even have a writing staff?
I mean, Vince is legitimately psychotic, so it makes sense that he would just do whatever, It seems now that, at least at the moment, he has a pretty good working relationship where, he lets Paul and Eric do most of the show writing. The producers meeting doesn't have like 50 people in it. They sign off on it and the show launches more or less as planned. And it's been okay. What the consequence is that the shows don't feel quite as like samey. If the shows are constantly being rewritten, then it feels like only the people who have top-level storylines really get focus from week to week, because you never know if your storyline is going to get thrown onto the cutting room floor at Vince's discretion under the old paradigm. And now it kind of feels like the entire roster is getting a little room to breathe and a little time on television. The other big change is that I don't know if this is an edict from USA and Fox Sports or a directorial decision, but they no longer do wrestling during commercial breaks, which they used to do all the time because there's a live audience, and it doesn't really make sense if you have to have a commercial break every 15 minutes to make sure all the matches, end on time. And I do think that during the 90s, they didn't... The matches during Raw were not very long, except for the main event, when they didn't have to... Usually they would run out of their scheduled commercial breaks, and then that would make those last matches feel really special. They'd overrun usually. Jim Ross, the announcer, would say, like, we've used their last commercial break. We're rolling until the show's over, and they'd run till like 11:15 or something, and it would feel like really awesome, and you get really excited about it. But
it's just like a legitimate sports event, huh?
Yeah, sure. But in more recent years, they put like a 20-minute match on at the start to get the crowd really fired up. I guess they have to do this now because the crowd doesn't get quite as fired up over the stars by themselves anymore. And they almost always have a big chunk of it during the commercial break, which kind of takes you out of the action a little bit if you're watching on television. And they haven't quite adjusted to this new rule where they don't wrestle anymore during commercial breaks. It means all the matches are very short. Or they do really awkward things, like they have a elimination or a potential disqualification that causes the action to stop for exactly the length of a commercial break, and it seems like really artificial and awkward. But like I said, so far things are up. Paul Heyman is on the show anyway because Brock Lesnar was re-signed to WWF, and he is like a central figure in the title picture. So Paul's on all the time. So this is hopefully not very much of a change for him. I can't really tell very much how things have changed on SmackDown. Eric Bischoff was an on-screen figure in the early parts of 2000 after WWF bought WCW. And he was like the on-screen GM for a while. But otherwise, he hasn't really had an on-screen presence on WWF in quite some time, except for like nostalgia like appearances, when they do like a yearly nostalgia show, or sometimes at WrestleMania. But yeah, so the current show recently followed today's show followed a pay-per-view, Extreme Rules, which was great. Paul Heyman got to come out and cut a whole promo. It was in Philadelphia, so we got to cut a whole promo about how it was in the spirit of ECW in his hometown. And I don't know if you remember, I mentioned this, but a while ago, Brock Lesnar actually has the Money in the Bank contract, which he won in like the stupidest fashion imaginable. So like that's a ladder match, right? So there were like 6 guys competing for 20 minutes to get this briefcase off from the top of the ladder to get the Money in the Bank contract, And at the end of the match, just Lesnar just fucking walks up and takes it. He wasn't even in the match, and
That's pretty great.
it's if there's probably like 20 guys in the back who thought to themselves like, well, I could have done that at any time. Like, if I had known, I would have just gone. So the main event was interesting and kind of highlights a bit of the edge they're trying to push. So there was an issue. There's a twofold issue. One was that when Vince's wife, Linda McMahon, began her campaign for the U.S. Senate in Connecticut around 2008, 2009, they pushed the on-screen television product to be from TV-14 to TV-PG, and that meant that like a lot of what the show was famous for, a lot of the sex and the blood and everything, and a lot of the violence was toned down considerably. A lot of that is for the better. It's really dangerous for a lot of these guys to be bleeding in the ring.
Sure.
A lot of the older wrestlers have hepatitis C. It's not and there's there are a lot of there's a lot of controversy surrounding guys who still wrestle to this day, who could get other wrestlers really sick because of the style they wrestle, like these bloodbath kind of guys. So cleaning that up was a big net positive for the health of the wrestlers, but it did kind of hamstring the kind of storylines they could produce. The other thing was interference from toy manufacturers. So like Mattel, who produces the figures. There are certain things that they just don't want to see on the television program. One of those is...
an incest storyline?
Well, I mean, nobody wants to see that except for Vince McMahon. And he doesn't want to see it, he wants to be in the middle of it, which is even more disgusting. But the big thing they put the kibosh on, and again, this is mostly for the best, but maybe not this specific year, 2019, is they have expressly forbidden male-on-female violence, which obviously for the most part, since the WWF has always been tremendously exploitative of its female wrestlers, has worked out for the better, because
sure.
When the women are in the match with the men, it's almost always, from Vince's standpoint, for the express purpose of humiliating the women.
Yeah.
And it's rarely to produce an underdog story. But so now that we have ascendant women athletes, now that some of the women's wrestlers are finally being taken seriously, you can use this to some extent to highlight sort of what professional sports often fails at in terms of the dynamic between the sexes. The professional sports has a really poor understanding of how to divide. They generally tend to support sports for women almost only begrudgingly because they're legally required to do it. Oftentimes female athletes get paid substantially less than their male counterparts, even on a national standpoint. One recent controversy, of course,
even a global standpoint.
Yeah, the women's U.S. national team is incredible. They are world class
and have been not out of nowhere. Yeah.
And they're dominant in their sport, but they are paid dramatically less than the men, who are completely unremarkable.
They're also far more popular too. I might add. So you can't even use the argument that the reason why they get paid less is because they have less eyes on them.
Sure, they have tremendous charisma. They're wonderful role models. They have everything going for them,
and they're fun to watch. they're fun. They're fun to watch. When they play the sport, it's a fun game. I wish I had that much fun watching the guys.
Right. So in combat sports, you have the concept of weight classes. Where
sure.
you generally try to group athletes to pretty close within their athletic skill level, within
especially
their builds.
In wrestling. That's a big thing. Yeah.
Well, in real actual non-professional, in boxing, in Greco-Roman wrestling, and Olympic wrestling, it is a thing. You want a relatively competitive match, so you pair people together who are roughly the same weight class. You could probably sort of eliminate the male-female sort of artificial split in sports by doing classes that are based on things like androgens and weight, or some combination of physical attributes that serve the same purpose of grouping roughly similar people of physical attributes together. This probably wouldn't happen anytime soon, just because I think most men are still sort of trained from birth to consider it, a downgrade to be paired against women. But just because of toxic masculinity. But there is an opportunity on the wrestling side, and I think that AEW might explore this just a little bit. Because
or we
these
could
people
just stop wrestling altogether.
Well, yeah, we could also stop wrestling. Wrestling is a garbage business. But so, like, for example, before all this PG stuff, there was Chyna, who was a very buff women's wrestler who competed against the men, and she wasn't that great, but it was credible that she seemed like she belonged in the ring with a lot of these guys. I mean, they were all taking performance-enhancing drugs, so they were all roided up like crazy. Chyna and all of them.
Including her. Yeah.
And she mostly wrestled against guys who were former cruiserweights, like Chris Jericho and Eddie Guerrero, guys who wrestled in the under 225 bracket. But from a standpoint of wrestlers as superheroes or wrestlers as basically fantasy fighters. If barring gender and sex dynamics, if you can believe that a 200-pound John Cena can fight a 450-pound Big Show, then probably you can wrap your brain around a 150-pound Ronda Rousey fighting a 200-pound John Cena. You could probably write a story that makes sense in that context. There's a wrestler right now in NXT by the name of Candice LeRae who made her career on the indie scene wrestling men. She wrestles a style that doesn't work against women because it's it requires what's called a lucha base, which is usually all these head scissors and flips that assume that your opponent is holding on to you while you do all your acrobatics, and they're much heavier than you, so they always have leverage against you, so they can keep you grounded. And that's hard to replicate against other women. The women that the WWF hires tend to be thinner. They tend to be fitness models. So there's room for this story to exist that the WWF doesn't do because they have this limitation that prevents them from exploring that space. So I was a little bit interested in this pay-per-view when they advertised as the main event. So Becky Lynch and Seth Rollins are the two champions of Raw, the men's and women's champion. And it was it became public after WrestleMania that they were in a relationship. They had been apparently for some time, and there had been some rumors leaking, probably because they were about to release a special where it shows them making out backstage after they both win their championships at WrestleMania, as a celebration to congratulate each other. Because they seemed like a really happy couple. So they had that play into the storyline in a way that I didn't expect. So Seth's current rival is this guy Baron Corbin. He's wholly unremarkable. He looks like a TGI Fridays manager. He used to be the on-screen GM of Raw, so he wears his vest and suit pants all the time. It looks kind of stupid, but he's not bad. He just isn't a main event caliber kind of guy. It's not a feud that you get excited about. But for a long time, they acted as though he had a lot of authority to make decisions on Raw. He was the on-screen authority figure. And so during a match with Rollins, he said that he gets to choose a special guest referee. And so he chose a female wrestler by the name of Lacey Evans. She's a relatively new call-up from NXT. She's the best way to describe her is that she's a white woman whose personality is that she's from the South, and always when she opens her mouth kind of sounds like she's about to say something a little bit racist. So she's obviously a heel. Her finisher is called the Women's Right, which I'm only mentioning because it's really funny.
That's actually
and it's literally it's literally just a punch to the face.
The suffrage of women.
So she needs a lot of work. She probably came up from NXT a little too soon. The punch to the face is my least favorite finisher of all time because all they do all match is punch each other in the face. So why is this punch so much better
straw that broke the
than
camel's
all the
back.
other
The
ones?
last
Seems
one.
to be the finisher.
One.
One day, a wrestler just punched another one, and they went down, and they're like, That had a name.
That's it. That's my finisher.
I was finisher the whole time.
So, like, the Big Show, his finishing move is a punch to the face, but that's because the Big Show is 500 pounds.
The Big Show has the women's
what
right?
else is he going to do?
Yes, the Big Show has the women's right. The Big Show was the original wrestling feminist.
He was the original wrestling ogre in a fucking fantasy dungeon with a wizard. It's the weirdest shit.
He probably wasn't the... He probably wasn't the original wrestling wizard.
That was like... I know that we always have referenced, like, what? It's not hot. There are no Hulkamaniacs here. But, like, it is just funny to me that there's a wizard going, like, oh, you're not going to beat this guy. The Big Show's just like, oh, ha, 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 oh, ha, ha. It just ends like that.
I mean, I'm glad that I showed that to you. It's probably the funniest thing that you'll ever see in wrestling, aside from the intentionally funny stuff.
I don't know. I love that guy in the stormtrooper costume.
Falls through the Shockmaster. No, but one thing, like,
yeah, the
I don't remember
Shockmaster.
this about the Dungeon
That was
of Doom,
good.
but did they ever show the Hulk Hogan just, like, going in? Or does he just start in it? Like, where is he?
I'm pretty sure he just starts there.
Like, this is a place you can go to. We don't know about it, but, it's there. Yeah. He found it.
It's in Machu Picchu.
It's the infamous Parts Unknown.
I also like the first of the Hardy Boy, like, stupid arc where he, like, does that slam onto the table and the table, like, slowly falls apart, like, in their house where like...
Well, I mean, that was before that they knew what that would become.
That was really damn funny. Like, I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I really get a kick out of how he's doing the dramatic voice and, like, Brother Nero, and that whole delivery. And then when he's passing, what was it, his stepfather or father-in-law or something, when like the guy was like, is everything, like, according to your tastes, Mr. Hardy? And he just drops his flair. He's just like, yeah. And then he gets back into character. It's, like, the funniest thing for me.
So I like the part from that segment where she, like, throws the baby at Jeff Hardy and it's a fake baby, and she's had, like, a fake baby the entire time. And Jeff just, like, never noticed.
Also, like, I'll bring you back to the place of Genesis, and it's just like the next room is an old wrestling ring, and they fight terribly. Like, this is great.
Like, in their house.
Yeah, like, and what's also
there's some,
like, this is the dumbest shit, but, like, retroactively people have come back to it. They're like, oh, okay.
So any time where Matt, like, legit breaks character within his, like, the Broken Hardy thing is fantastic. You know, there's the part from the actual final deletion where he's like, behold, a dilapidated boat. And then from behind it, like, Jeff comes out with a Roman candle launcher, like a fire, and he just goes, "Oh shit!" and, like, in his accent and everything, like in his original North Carolinian accent.
I also just love the whole delete thing where, like, it's a quick YouTube video where he's just saying, delete, 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 and every time he says it, like, he's got some servant or something behind him he's got a book that has the word delete written on it, and every time he says delete, the guy, like, underlines it one more time. It's like, that's fantastic.
It makes me think of Death Note.
Is idiotic.
So you've seen the one where he, like, loses his memory and then thinks he's an engineer.
Oh yeah, he's like at the computer.
And then,
delete.
His let me check my email. I also
like
delete,
when he goes, like, is everything good? C. That means yes, right? And he nods. Okay, good. Yeah. Dude, that's so good. Good times.
I know I had a point.
Yeah. Becky
So, you know, Lacey Evans was the heel ref, so of course she wasn't, you know, counting things fair. She was obviously favoring Baron Corbin, and I think this was a title match. But you never actually expect the title to change hands on an episode of live television. So when things seemed darkest, Becky Lynch actually came out and saved Seth Rollins from Lacey Evans and Baron Corbin, which is very unusual. You know, you don't usually see the guy play the damsel in distress in professional wrestling. So it seemed like it was a change in the standard dynamic where it was acknowledged that she was, like, the dominant star and he was the support, even though they were both champions. It was kind of like in Imperator Furiosa and Mad Max kind of situation, you know, where they're both badasses, but, like, she's clearly the dominant one.
Wow.
So they had a mixed tag match at Extreme Rules where the two of them put their titles on the line against Baron Corbin and Lacey Evans. And they won. I wouldn't say that... You know, it was kind of an opportunity to see whether or not they were going to kind of blur the line or like allow Lynch to shine against Baron Corbin a little bit. When they did the last like really high profile mixed tag match that I can remember that they did was Ronda Rousey and Kurt Angle versus Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. And that was a clear mismatch in the sense that like Triple H and Kurt Angle are evenly matched, but Ronda Rousey would like literally murder Stephanie McMahon like practically by staring at her. So like most of the match was built around Triple H keeping Stephanie out of the ring because of the limitations on wrestling. Mixed tag matches always have a rule that if you tag your partner into the match, the other person also immediately has to tag out. So you never have a man and a woman in the ring at the same time legally, which tends to make the matches extremely awkward. That's why it only really works in a situation like the Rousey McMahon one, where you're like deliberately trying to keep Stephanie McMahon away from Ronda Rousey, because that's like what the whole match is building up to, is that like comeuppance where she like breaks Stephanie McMahon's arm, more or less. So anyway, the finish of the match was that Baron Corbin did his finisher on Becky Lynch, which was like the only time that they were really in the ring together. And then Seth Rollins like flipped his shit. It was a no disqualification match, so he pulled a weapon out from behind the ring and just beat the living hell out of Baron Corbin, and then won the match. Which kind of like, I felt like it sort of pushed the WWF back to what we think of as the standard gender dynamic, where it's Rollins' responsibility to protect his woman. And I was a little bit disappointed that's the direction that they went in for the finish. And then after that, Brock Lesnar came out, cashed in his Money in the Bank contract, and became the champion. So it was like sort of like doubly disappointing in the sense that after winning the title from him at WrestleMania, Lesnar immediately got it back. And that, if you were really all in on Becky Lynch and you really wanted to see the crowd get hot for her, you should have had her like come back out again after taking the End of Days, the Baron Corbin's finisher, and come out and like just like beat the shit out of Brock Lesnar with a baseball bat or something. Like, sure, she's not a compelling threat for him, like, face-to-face, but, with a weapon in a match where weapons are allowed, just pull out a fucking, like, 2x4 and beat the shit out of him while he's focusing on Seth Rollins, And, like, even if she was not successful and took an F5, which is Lesnar's finisher, at least that, like, elevates her to the level of a legitimate threat, with a weapon to Brock Lesnar. That puts them on the same stage. And they didn't do that.
Changing direction here, but, like, what is F5?
So the F5 is Brock Lesnar's finishing move. It's called that because it's like a spinning like body slam. So I guess it's supposed to evoke a hurricane. Okay. It's somewhat notoriously how John Cena got his finisher when he was a heel, and it was like really juvenile too because John Cena's finishing move is called the FU.
Oh, okay.
And so it's like, well, you've got the F5, I've got the FU. And so eventually it became that. Right now it's called the AA, the Attitude Adjustment. And his submission move. Let me look up the exact John Cena's submission move.
FU2, like the number 2.
It's close. His submission finisher is called the step over toe hold face lock, where he's got like one leg locked and his hands around your face, basically pulling your neck back. The initials are the STF,
oh, come on.
And it used to be the STFU, as you can imagine. And so they shortened it to STF, and they made up a bullshit like acronym for it, a backronym for it.
That's such an 80s thing to do, like come up with a word and then like figure out what the letters stand for.
This was the early 2000s.
Yeah, that's just funny. Like the STFU, we gotta have that. So we can't.
So this was the same year that Shane Helms became the Hurricane. So he became a superhero themed wrestler, and he was treated as a joke. But the funniest thing that came out of it was that he had a partner called Rosie, who was a superhero in training, which was probably the most charming acronym from that.
Oh, like, oh my god! All right.
Which I think was actually a joke made by The Rock. Yeah, The Rock, like, for all of his prowess on the mic, was never known for being like an adult.
It doesn't matter what you think.
Mm-hmm. So there's a great like rock promo where he does that response. It's like, it doesn't matter what you think, and the Angelo goes like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like they agree with him. Like Jesus.
That's great.
Wow.
Okay. Anyway, that's all I had. Thank you for giving me, I guess, about 25 minutes.
Yeah. We can actually move on to our weekly business then from here on out.
Sure.
Nice.
So, regarding fan comments, Trichologist had a couple. He said, "Oh man, Ninja Spirit on Commodore 64. That game I played.
It's a good game."
He said that game I played, but never knew what to do in it. I had Ziggurat on my wish list. What I saw is like Hexen Heretic shooty game, but problems come from resource management, if I recall. And Trigger are regarding Trigger Animation Studios. Trigger are also known to be very hyperish and randy. Yep. And regarding funny games, Switch, or its other name, Panic. Random humor at every button press, and there's a lot of buttons.
Yeah, this was a Sega CD game.
And Dungeon Land plays like a more refined Gauntlet game with constant jabs at D&D tropes. I can get behind that. Viscera Cleanup Detail, which, if you don't know that game, that's basically like the hero of some video game has already been here, and you're the guy cleaning up like all the blood on the walls and stuff like that. That's like the premise of the game.
I have to look up. So there's a game called I think it's Serial Cleaner or something like
similar.
that. I'm curious if that's what that game was called in America or something.
Viscera Cleanup Detail, I think originally was a Half-Life 1 mod, if I'm not mistaken.
Anyway, Saints Row games, we've already talked stuff about that. Jazz Punk is referenced in Nonsense Bonanza. Yup. And then suggesting some others, like Shower with Your Dad, which is the name of a video game. Some of the digital eel games, the Shadow Warrior is like Quip Central. Living Corpse says, games that made me chuckle throughout. Armed and Dangerous, the part where the heroes think a guard is asking for a kiss when he's asking for keys because of his heavy accents. Like, give me the keys. Like, what? Okay. Game moment that made me bust out laughing. The final boss of Lollipop Chainsaw, just like what it is. I was at a friend's house when he reached the final boss. We were laughing so hard he had to pause the game. After 5 minutes, we ended up laughing again. And finally, and since Lotus Prince brought up Eternal Darkness, the fake to be continued, like in a sequel screen, like when you beat a level and you come back and the game just stops and it teases like, we'll finish the adventure.
Like Back to the Future
Darkness,
thing.
Sanity's Redemption. And I was like, wait, what? But then the game resumes. And he says that's ironically on point, since any sequel or spiritual sequel keeps getting shot down. And then Falcavon says, oh, so that's what Igavania means regarding like Igarashi and Castlevania. I think
we'll clarify on that. Like he does not like calling the genre of games Metroidvania, mostly because he, according to him, didn't take any inspiration from Metroid when he made the game. When he made Symphony of the Night, he claims that it was more inspired by Zelda and Zelda 2.
I can kind of see it, but like level design feels very Metroid-y.
Yeah, I think it's just I don't know what it is, but like, why if it were being like respectful of Nintendo's IP, why would he reference a different one? You know what I mean? Like, I'm inclined to believe him if he's, even though it's strange. You know what I mean?
It's also like, to me, it's kind of a meaningless distinction. But at the same time, like if I say a Metroid game and I say like an Igavania, and I like give you a game in the genre, a lot of the time it's pretty clear which of the two the game is taking homage to, or which like side of the genre it belongs. So like Axiom Verge is like very clearly a Metroid game and not a Symphony of the Night game.
Sure.
Not that they're all like this, but.
Also, I think I kind of mentioned this or touched on it, when we were talking about the Igavania games, but like, a surprisingly few Metroidvanias are on the Castlevania end. They're mostly like Metroid. Meaning there isn't a whole lot of like stat gathering and equipment gathering.
Castlevania's very RPG-ish. as of Symphony of the Night
Yeah.
onward.
There are only a few notable games, like Salt and Sanctuary is obviously, a Souls-like
I
and
cannot wait to play that.
and a Igavania type
Yeah.
game, all wrapped up into one. I mean, but they're by and large, there are very few Metroidvania games that have the robust stat building that a Castlevania game actually does.
But anyway, Vakavan goes on to say, I think the funniest game moment I witnessed was unintentional from the game, is usually when a game starts glitching or bugging out. And he also says, I had my share of laughs playing Spider-Man 2 on GameCube. That game was buggy as hell. And it also has the classic, oh no, if I flip this pizza, Mr. Aziz is going to flip out. Doc Connor.
So what was that?
I got
was
so caught up in what I was doing, I forgot all about it.
Was that actually that slow in
Yes.
the live
It was
version, or
about
was
I mean,
that like...
I know that there are like YouTube poops where it's like, I forgot, but like it was kind of slow.
No, it's obviously like a phoned in like voiceover from Tobey Maguire, because I think he was contractually obligated to
really
be
is.
there
Like, I got so
for
caught up in
recording.
what I was doing, I forgot all about it. Like, it's basically like that, so it sounds kind of funny.
They could have gotten a non-union guy,
It's just funny
and
'cause
he
it
would have
sounds
done a
little
better
just
job.
Like, read my mind. Like, that's just how the delivery is. Although
I don't want to be
Although
here.
speaking of the Spider-Man games, there is one unintentionally. Well, I don't even know if it's unintentional, but like a funny moment that I forgot about that's like hilarious from Spider-Man 3, the game that nobody cared about. There's this.
Yeah, that game's not good.
There's a scene very early on where you have to save someone from a building, like they're trapped in rubble or something, and there's like or they're tied up or whatever, and there's a bomb that's gonna go off, and you have to do a couple.
You mean Barney? Barney Rubble. Trouble!
But like you have to do like a quick time event to get to them. So like it's one of those things where you're swinging, press the button. Okay, swing, press the correct button. Good. But like if you mess up the final button press, it's like straight up hilarious because you do like a downward swing, like you're going into your descent to like land, and if you mess up the button press, you just belly flop face plant,
shit.
like, poof, and like you just hit the ground so hard, and it cuts to the person. Like, was Spider-Man 3 like a launch title or something? Because the graphics look very dated. Like they look like old PS3 plasticky faces. Like you see like a low quality PS3 face of the civilian go like you face plant, and the civilian goes, "I'm gonna die," and then it just shows the building going like, poof, just blowing up. It's just like the funniest shit. Like you've got to look that up. It is so funny. I like it. May or may not be intentionally funny. Like the fact that you face plant so hard is like pretty slapstick. Even though you just like ruined your mission, but it is a riot.
Yeah,
and you probably died.
Yeah, you have to continue from there. You probably just get to redo the QT or something. But the sequence is really funny.
It was a launch transition game, so it came out for every. It came out for every system in the sun: Game Boy Advance, PC,
and the Wii version looked like shit,
Nintendo
too.
DS, PlayStation 2, Wii, Xbox 360, PS3, and PSP. So it came out for everything.
The graphics are like the face of the civilian you're saving looks just like okay. Now anyway, for our fan question, Insane Buffoon asks, what video game boss has frustrated you the most? I can think of probably a couple. Ones that come to mind. I guess off the top of my head, I can think of 3. One of them is, this is such a stupid thing to bring up, so I'll knock it out of the way first, is from Conker's Pocket Tales, the best game ever made. There's this one boss that you have to, like, stomp on parts of when it shows up, but, like, it's just really janky. It is extremely hard to not get hit with by this thing when it comes up. So I was dying to this thing like 1,000 times, like the swamp boss, if that makes any sense to anybody, which of course it doesn't. Another one is the final boss of Jet Force Gemini, Mizar. The bosses in that game are pretty tough just anyway, but the thing with Mizar is that you're really supposed to use homing missiles against him. Like, he gets up in your face and does a bunch of attacks, and you gotta dodge them, and it can be a little tricky to do, and then he flies away, like, to the background to get ready for, like, some long-distance attack, so while he's flying away, you gotta hit him in the back a bunch of times. And it's way easier to do that with homing missiles, because they home. Like, it's not easy to hit him. The thing with this game, though, is that you play as 3 characters, Juno, Vela, and Lupus, and by endgame, with few exceptions, any character can go just about anywhere. So if you see like an ammo max capacity upgrade, you can pick it up with anybody. And whoever you pick it up with, the other 2 can't get it. So I was trying to distribute my homing missiles relatively evenly, and that was kind of a mistake, because the final boss you have to do with Juno. So like, you really should be just pumping him full of homing missiles. So that was really, I actually like rage quit the game and played it like years later. And the final boss that drove me insane was, again, this is an obscure one, but the final boss of Galarian's Ash. He's just bullshit. Like, that guy has health for days. And the thing with Galarians is, like, in a war of attrition, he's gonna win. Because Galarians is, like, low-key on a time limit where your attacks are psychic attacks, and they basically have ammo, and you can inject yourself with a shot, which is basically like your ammo reload, until you run out. And there's no melee or anything. But what makes things even more difficult is that over time you have this bar that slowly fills, like very slowly, but still. And when it fills completely, you basically short. It's called shorting, where you just flip out and go into a psychic like paroxysm, and you move extremely slowly, are invincible, and if you get close to something, you'll one-shot them. But it drains your health. And of course it's not going to work on bosses. The problem is that you need an injection of something to make that go away. And if you run out of those, then you better not short again, or you're just going to stand there and be invincible until you die, which sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. And the thing is, the boss will sometimes throw these, like, I don't know how you're going to dodge these kind of attacks. So you can use like a shield to block those, but using the shield makes your bar rise a lot. So that whole boss is management and also pure bullshit, because he's throwing every attack at you under the sun, and he has so much health. Like this was like, I almost like abandoned my recording of that Let's Play installment, and I was like, I'm gonna come back to this tomorrow. Like, I tried just the boss for like an hour's worth of trying and dying. It was infuriating. So those were the frustrating bosses that I can think of immediately.
I have one in particular. I think it was the there are a couple bosses. I forget what they're called, but on Skyward Sword, I particularly had a problem with the way that the control scheme works in that game with the Wii Motion Plus. It never jived well with how I moved my hand or what my system was. So I got very frustrated with the extremely accurate movements that you needed to do to play that game. I loved the game otherwise, but I got so frustrated playing that game, and I normally really love mainline Zelda games. And I particularly was very disappointed by that. So that's really the major one that comes to mind for me. How about you, OldManStompy?
I have a couple. So like, a lot of my backlog is like role-playing games. So I almost don't want to like highlight too many of these, because if I have a problem with a boss in a role-playing game, like a lot of the time it's just because like my build, especially in a JRPG, or my level is too low. And a lot of the time that tends to rear its head in a frustrating way at like a final boss, because a lot of the time your options for level grinding are limited. There just isn't any of the game left. So your only choice is to like bang your head against the boss.
Oh, I got another one here.
Yeah. And so like the worst ones for those offenders, I think, would be like Final Fantasy V and the Saga games. Not because Final Fantasy V is particularly difficult, just I didn't, like, with all the jobs, I didn't make good job choices. And with the Saga games, like, you're locked into your build for a long time, and it takes a long time to like, correct yourself if your build is incorrect. Other than that, I can think of Mystic Heroes. That's a PlayStation 2 and GameCube game. It's like a chibi Dynasty Warriors game made by Koei. For some reason, the final bosses of that game were just obnoxiously difficult for me. Like, the last world of that was just insane. I don't know if I was doing it wrong or like those games are also really grindy, so maybe I just need to level up my stats. And the last thing has nothing really to do with the difficulty of the boss, but more like backseat gaming. Which so
Oh, no.
you'll probably appreciate the story, and so Minty Mitz is actually sitting across from me, and she'll appreciate hearing the story a second time. Which is when I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles on the 3DS. This was like
Is that a good
one
version
of
that, by the way?
It's fine. I beat it just because it was handheld. I never finished the Wii version. I probably never will finish the Wii version just because it's like an 80-hour game. It's serviceable. There's like no slowdown. All the features are there. The graphics are much worse, but it was still worth playing to me.
Gotcha.
Anyway, so this was like one of the first really long games that we played after we started living together. That I played after we started living together after we got married. Like I would play it after work every day, and you had to because it's like an 80-hour game. And so she would like watch over my shoulder, and she would give me all these suggestions, which I was not used to having because I was not used to living with another human being, all the time. So she would tell me like, "Oh yeah, you haven't used this character in a while. I want to see them. What do they do?" And I would know they're not like part of the story. That they're not part of the party that I constructed for myself. I am definitely the kind of gamer who like picks 3 or 4 or whatever the party size is that works really well and uses them the whole game. And Xenoblade does reward you learning to use all the characters, but it tends to be like it tends to take time to like learn how to build them correctly and learn how to use them correctly. So there was like a boss fight against a sniper, and she told me like, "Oh, you have a sniper on your team. You haven't used her in a while. You should put her in your party. I bet she's really good in this fight. And also, she has like a personal relationship with the boss, so you should put her in." So I did, but I didn't know how to use her, and so I was just getting like really, really aggravated and really, really frustrated because she'd just been like sitting over my shoulder and telling me what to do like the entire game. So of course, the character she dies like really early on in the fight, and I'm practically throwing my DS. I'm like, "This is a disaster. Why did you do this?" And so.
This is why I like Minty Mitz. She can torture you unlike any other person that I know.
Of course, even with the game isn't that hard, so even with only the 2 characters, I managed to win anyway. And the poor girl's like corpse was like all the way in the back, because she's a sniper, and so I had to go back and get her and bring her all the way back. And so like that became like a meme in our marriage for like the next month. And that if she was like, "Oh no, the store is closed. This is a disaster." it's like okay, fine, I get it. I overreacted a little bit. It's like, a little bit? Did you listen to yourself? This is a disaster. I think you need to hear it again. So.
Well, that actually just conjured up terrible memories for me in trying to beat Chaos in Final Fantasy 1. So I was a crazy person and wanted to beat all of the Final Fantasies in a row. And I stopped right at 1.
Did you now?
What was that? Yeah, seriously. OldManStompy's trying. Anyway, I got to the very end of 1, and I think I rested at a tent in the final dungeon, and I found out I was under-leveled to fight Chaos, and there is absolutely no way for me to go back to anywhere and level up.
That brings up
so,
a point
yeah,
to
so
me, too.
the,
but yeah, go ahead.
The original Final Fantasy, I'll just briefly share a story about this. The original Final Fantasy, for one, is notorious about this. Once you reach a certain level, you cannot get out of the final dungeon.
Yep.
Unless you have like a specific spell on a specific character.
Oh,
and if you run an FMP, then you're boned. But when I played the original Final Fantasy for the NES, I got all the way to Chaos, and I died. And then, without really thinking about it, I deleted my game save. And then I played all the way through to Chaos a second time. And then I deleted my game save again.
Why?
And then I don't know what happened. I think I was panicking. So it took me maybe like 15 years.
You blacked out and everything was erased.
I think that I think I just like tried to start it's insane that this would actually happen, but I think I actually started a new game and then managed to save. Panicking without even thinking about it.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
I don't think that I failed to hold the reset button while pushing power.
That's not. also not necessary.
I know. I'm joking. It's just,
Yeah.
it's a thing that I was superstitious about for a long time
No,
because
but
I was a
this
kid.
brings up actually a couple things for me as well. One of them I'll knock out of the way real quick because I haven't actually played this myself. But in Metroid Prime 2, there's the Boost Guardian, and from what I've heard,
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
heard on hard mode, it's like it's insanely hard. Like our friend Luminaire has played through the Metroid Prime trilogy.
It's hard. It's hard to begin
Yeah,
with.
like for the Metroid Prime trilogy, like our friend Luminaire has played through all three of those, and like he was just pulling his hair out for the Boost Guardian in on hard mode. Apparently, it was hard enough to the point where like the devs couldn't beat it. So if you play the version like on the Wii, it's like more fair than the GameCube version. But regarding what you guys were talking about, where you get caught up in a level, I think I might have mentioned this on the podcast before, but in Baten Kaitos, there are...
Oh, I know what you're talking about, yeah.
There are two ways to save the game. Red flowers and blue flowers. Red flowers, you save and that's it. Blue flowers, you also are given the option to go into an area where you can level up. So that's the game works a little weirdly that way. Like, you can kill enemies for hours and hours and gain all the experience you want, but you cash in the experience. Like, you talk to a guy who's like, oh, you have this much experience? That means you level up. So you don't level up when you gain the experience. So there's this one dungeon in the game that only has one save point in it, and it's red. So if you save in that dungeon, that's your level. That's what you're staying at. I hope you're good enough to beat the boss. So it's not like the hardest boss in the game or anything, but it's pretty easy to go into that dungeon unprepared. And if you save in there, you're fucked. Like, you can kill enemies and get some of their attacks, like their Magnus, but, like, you will not level up. You can't. So that's like the game's like brick wall. Like, I really hope you can beat the Deadly Trio, because if you can't, then you might have put yourself in an unwinnable situation.
Ugh.
And that's
Yeah,
that's
I hate
like,
that
that's
the
a
most.
decent amount of time into the game as well.
So I want to give an honorable mention, since she's not on the podcast, to like all the raid bosses in Final Fantasy XIV,
The
especially
Savage
like
Kefka.
the yeah, oh yeah. So in the most recent tier, in the most recent expansion, I mean not the most recent anymore, but the most recent that has endgame raids. The three raid tiers were themed after old Final Fantasy games. So the first one was like Neo X Death. The second one was Kefka into God Kefka, and then the third one it started with
Neo X
Chaos,
Death was awesome.
but then it ended as Omega Weapon as the final boss of the raid. And as I recall, so usually the last one is like practically impossible for all but the most hardcore raiders. But the one before that, like the third one of the tier of 4, because they usually come in sets of 4, is also like usually exceptionally difficult, and is like the thing that cuts out sort of the really dedicated raid groups from the people who just kind of want to like test out the waters. So like the one before Kefka was Guardian, which is like the robot that's like right before Kefka in Kefka's tower. In Final Fantasy VI. And in Final Fantasy VI, he like loads these programs that are like based off of bosses that you've faced in the past. So in the raid, he like loads the program sometimes, and then sometimes he doesn't load the programs, and then sometimes he like doesn't load one of them, but you have to remember which one it is because he'll use it later, but there won't be a warning. God. And you have to like know all the patterns, and that's on top of like all the regular raid stuff. He's got like missiles that go in a crisscross pattern, and you can like walk into one by accident. But sometimes, you know, the game lags, or like your internet lags, and you think that you didn't hit the missile, but you actually hit the missile. Like I don't. So a lot of MMOs have what's called a global cooldown. They just don't require you to do actions more than like a couple of seconds apart to account for like the server lag of having to coordinate 8 separate players plus the boss at the same time. But at the highest level, like, all bets are off. I was told that the hardest fight in Stormblood, the one that only out of all my friends only Mr. Ryu has even tried, has actions like literally every half a second.
Jesus
and
Christ.
like fighting it without a wired internet connection is like literally impossible.
Wow. Well, any final mentions here before we wrap up this week?
I would say the hardest boss is Lotus Prince in Clask.
No, actually, I got beaten a couple times after that, after you walked away.
Well, shut the fuck up. You're impossible to me.
They're referring to at my barbecue this past weekend. I have this really fun Dutch game called Clask that is basically like magnetic air hockey with a few other additional flourishes. Definitely look into it if that sounds like it's up your jam, up your alley. Because it's a fun game.
I actually do have one more boss to mention, which is Final Fantasy XIV related. So there's a fat black chocobo mount that in America you can buy for like $40 on Amazon, or rather you buy something for $40 on Amazon. I think you get it for free. Is that right? So in China, they don't have Amazon, I guess, or they don't have a deal with Amazon. So what you have to do is you go to KFC and you have to order like 4 meals, and then you earn the black chocobo.
Family.
But what people are doing in China right now they're just ordering a family meal for 4 people and eating it at once and treating it like a boss and like posting on the internet as though they're doing a raid. But it's actually just like a giant fucking meal that like makes you gain like 10 pounds from eating it.
Dude.
That's amazing.
For real.
It's disgusting. And the reward, if you've seen the fat chocobo skin, the mount in Final Fantasy XIV, it like can barely move, and
I've only seen a picture.
Like it only runs. It only runs because you like dangle some food in front of it, and it just kind of like waddles after the food.
So wow. So it's basically like the stick in front of the horse with like the carrot.
Yeah.
That's amazing. All right. Any final mentions before we move on and wrap things up for this week?
That's really it for me. I really had to get that last bit in there.
Real quick, I will say Calamite and the 4 Kings from Dark Souls.
4 Kings was the one that I had the most trouble with.
Is the fucking worst.
Oh, yeah.
And Fume Knight from Dark Souls 2 was pretty damn brutal as well.
Naming a Souls-like game almost feels like cheating.
I know.
For this category.
Well, the thing
the 4 Kings is the one that I had the most trouble with, for sure.
The thing with Fume Knight is that like I play a tank, but he does severe chip with, I believe, dark damage, and once he powers up, it's dark plus fire, so he's just doing like very visible chunks of health off of me, like when I'm blocking with my great shield. I'm like, I have to like learn to dodge. I'm like, oh shit, like now that I've been playing the game for like 60 hours, now I need to learn how to dodge. Like, great. Against like the hardest boss in the game. Like, I had an easier time with a lot of Bloodborne's bosses than I did with fucking Fume Knight. Like, I beat the Bloodborne Orphan of Kos on my 8th try. I was less mad at that boss than I was for like Fume Knight.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's the show for this week. I want to thank all of our fans who contributed questions. Living Corpse, that was a good one.
Insane Buffon.
Please keep us. Insane
cool
Buffoon.
comments.
Jeez, I always get them. I think I get them confused all the time.
Well, yeah, the name's Rhyme, I guess.
I feel bad. I'm sorry. But please keep us supplied with awesome topics by submitting questions of your own via the YouTube and SoundCloud pages. While there, please give us thumbs ups, likes, and 5-star ratings on iTunes. While there, it helps promote and spread awareness of the show, and any bit of encouragement helps keep the show going. I always get tired on this last one. You can also catch us on Tuesdays on our sister podcast, Corrective Consciousness, the in-depth look at this week in our lives. Finally, you can friend me as vysethebold on Steam, PSN, Xbox Live, Twitter, Switch, and Battle.net.
And you can follow me on my YouTube channel, Lotus Prince. You can hit me up on Twitter at Lotus Prince. And finally, if you are interested in seeing my videos early, currently uploading Resident Evil Remake, getting on exclusive live streams, Juggernaut, PS1, selecting upcoming games for me to Let's Play. I got a pretty hype one coming up after Remake. And getting involved in a conversation with me and other patrons on Discord, then perhaps consider swinging by my Patreon account, which can be found at patreon.com/LotusPrince.
And you can find me as OldManStompy on most major gaming and social media networks, except for Steam, where my username is This Is a Disaster, appropriately. Because you have to own it.
All right. Well, we'll catch everybody on Tuesday for another episode of Reactive. We'll catch you then.
Until next time, everyone.
Cheers.